All right, good morning. Today we're going to talk about another way of writing iterations called while loop. Now, to recap, we have learned how to use for loop to write iterations, where for loop iterates on iterables, and the iterables could be list, string, or even set and range. Iterables must be finite, and you need to know the number of elements in the iterables when you write the code. So for example here, for x in range 100, so this will generate integers from 0 to 99, so there will be 100 iterations. And this for loop here, where for x in a list which contains the number 435, it will iterate 3 iterations. And for x in a string with 5 numbers here, 5 characters here, A, B, C, D, E, so the number of iterations will be 5. Okay. Now, if you remember earlier on, we also have an example where we ask user to enter a number, and for a number of integers that the user want to add, we store it as a variable end, and then the user will input these end values, and the program will add these end values as a result to display the sum of all these n numbers. So in this case, we run the for loop for I in range n. So n here is already defined after the execution of line 1. So when the execution of line 3 happens, the value of n is already defined. So we know exactly how many iterations are required in this for loop here, which is n. Okay. Now, if you look at the second calculator, where it accepts any number of inputs, and for simplicity, we assume user always enter integers, and the user does not have to enter how many numbers it wants to add. Instead, it will enter 0 to indicate that this is to stop the program. Okay. So when the program exits, it will output the total sum of user input. So the difference is, in this code here, the user already have to decide how many numbers that the user wants to add. In this different scenario here, the user does not need to know how many numbers that he wants to add. He will keep adding until there is no number that he wants to add. He will enter 0, and that will stop the program. Okay. Once the program stops, it will output the total sum of the user's input. Now, in this case, since we don't know how many iterations, we can't use for loop. And that's where we look at while loop. So while loop is basically a way to write iterations where it tests for a condition. So it means as long as the condition is true, it's going to run the following statements inside the block. Now, just like for loop, the block is intended, okay? And we start with, at the beginning, we start with checking the condition. If it's true, you run the statement. At the end, after you finish the last line of the statement, you go back and check the condition again. And if it's true, you run the statement again, and then you go back and check the condition again. And if it's false, then you end it. Once it's false, it stops iterating. All right. So for our example here, I'm going to write using while loop of keep asking user for input until user enters 0 to stop the program. So that will be our simple calculator. So we can borrow the code from above, except that we can't write for I in range n. All right. And we don't ask user for how many numbers that he wants to add first. All right. Instead, we're going to start with a while loop with a condition. And such that if this condition is true, I will keep asking user for input. All right. So first, wow. So we're going to ask user input. Okay. And again, here we assume user always enter integers. So I'm going to do typecasting. Okay. Enter a number, or in particular here is an integer. All right. And then I do typecast int because it's always integer. So while value is not equal to 0, and we add that value to result, and then we ask user for input again. We update the value again, all right? And I'm gonna run this one time. So at the beginning, result is equal to 0, and you ask at line 2, it asks user for an input an integer. Suppose I enter 1, all right? And then it will go to line 3 and check whether 1 is not equal to 0. Since 1 not equal to 0, it will add 1 to result. So at this moment, the value of result will be 1. And then it will go to line 5, where you ask user to enter integer again. And suppose I enter 2. Now I enter 2, it will actually go to line 3 and check whether 2 is not equal to 0. Since it is not equal to 0, it can add 2 to result. So now the result will be 3, and it asks user for input again. And suppose I enter 0. Now at this moment, when I enter 0, it will go back to condition and check whether 0 is not equal to 0. Now 0 not equal to 0 is false, so it will stop. It will not execute line 4 and line 5. It will exit the while loop and go to line 6 to print the sum of all the integers that I have entered, which is 1 plus 2, which is 3. Okay, so if you want to look at it step by step, it's useful to print out the intermediate value. So for example, you can print out result now is what? Okay, so at every iteration, it will print out the intermediate value of the result. So example, in this case, I have 1. So it says result now is 1. Result will be the total sum of the integers that user has entered so far. Okay, so here, result is the sum of values that user has entered so far. So at the beginning, it's 0 because user has not entered anything. So result is equal to 0. Okay. So every single iteration, the value of result will change. So now if I add, for example, 2, now result now is 3. So it add 2 to the previous value of the result, which is become 3. So now if I add 0, final value will be just result itself, which is 3. Okay, so you can interpret this as saying that as long as value is not equal to 0, then you add value to result, and then you print and ask value again. Okay, so we have I'm gonna write it down. So the structure of for loop, structure of while loop, okay, is such that we need a condition. This is a Boolean expression. It can be true or false. Okay. And in the condition, usually, typically in the condition, we have a variable. So typically, we have a variable. It can be more than one variable in the condition. Okay. So the variable conditions, so as long as the condition is true, it will run the statements, block statements in the while loop. Okay, and remember these are intended statements. Okay, indicate that they are in the block of the while loop. Okay, so once conditions become false, okay, it will stop iterating and exit the while loop. All right, so let's look at another example here. So suppose you are given a string password, which is initialized to some value 1, 2, 3, 4 as a string, and you're asked to write a program to ask user for input of the password in order to log into the computer. So As long as the user input does not match the value of the password, you will keep asking user for input. All right, so let's run this password first. So that password is initialized and defined. Now we're going to write this using while loop. So we need a condition. What's the condition? The condition is that. So we're going to write the condition. So the conditions for our while loop. So first, you need to understand that this depends on user input. So we don't know how many iterations. So we can't write using for loop. We need to write using while loop. Right. So what does while loop mean? It require a condition. So the conditions. So first, the condition is that users input does not match to value, does not match password. Okay. And what's the block statement? Okay. So we need a block statement. So inside the while loop, here is a block of statements. Right. So what could be the statements? Okay. The block of statements will execute just the following. We'll just basically asking user for input again. Right. So as long as the condition does the conditions is met, that is user does not match the password. Okay, as long as the condition is true, which is when user input does not match the password, you're gonna run the statement where the statement is just to simply ask user for input again. All right, so it's easy. So we're gonna run a while loop and we're gonna detect the condition that is user input is not equals to password. Okay, that will be our Boolean expression, our conditions. And once you put a colon here and you press enter, it will automatically indent it for you. Represent right now you are writing the block of statements. So the block of statements simply asks user for input again. So you ask user for input, enter your password. Right? And that's it. Okay. So as long as user input is not equal to password, you need to ask user input again. Okay. So if user input already is equal to password, or user finally enters something that is equals to the password, then you can, for example, display a meaningful message, successfully log in. Right? Now, before we run this code, you need to understand every time you write a conditions or a statement, is this defined? Now, user input is not defined at the beginning. Okay, so you could ask user input at the beginning. All right, and then we run as long as user input is not equal to password. You ask user input for passwords again. As long as it is not equal, you keep asking. At the end, once it is equal, you put successfully login. Let's run. Suppose I put some values. It doesn't match. It keep asking again. So you try different times, and so on and so forth. So it will keep on continuing until it's run out of memory. Okay, then it will say, this is what we call the infinite loop, or until user enter a right password, and then it will stop, and it will execute line 4 and say successfully login. Now, let's look at these conditions in detail. Right here. So we have seen an example of condition, which is whether the value is not equal to 0 or whether user input is not equal to password. Now, this condition here is very important, okay? Because the condition basically illustrates whether you will start an iteration and whether the iteration will run forever, okay? So for example, in this example here, we have x equals to 100, while x greater 100, you ask user for an input. Okay, so you ask how many iterations will the loop run? Okay, so it starts off with x equals to 100. As long as x is greater 100, you continue to iterate. So how many iterations is going to be? So we start with the first round. X equals to 100 is x greater than 100. So this condition will be false. 100 is not greater than 100, so the condition is false. Remember, once the condition is false, you stop executing anything. You stop executing the block of statements in a while loop, you exit the while loops. So in this case, it will be 0. Okay? It will be 0 because x is initialized to 0, where the condition is false at the first round of checking, at the first iteration. Okay? So exit while loop. So it won't run any iteration at all. So, okay. Now, how about the second example? How many iterations will the loop run? We start off with x equals to 100. Now the condition is true. X is equals to 100 because you initialize to 100 and you check whether it's equal to 100. This is true. And then you ask user for input. Now, in this case, so in this case here, if you keep running it, you will see that you write a number, say 1, you enter a number again, and so on. It seems like it keeps continuing. It's not stopping. Now, the reason is because you update the value of user input, but your condition here depends on the value of x. So the value of x was never updated. Okay, so you basically, the value of x stays as 100. You only update the value of user input, which this user input is not part of the condition. The value of x remains the same. And hence, this loop here will run forever. Okay, so this will run infinite. All right, because the condition involves only the value of x, which is always stay as which is always stays at 100. So the condition is always true. All right, so the condition is always true. You just update the value of user input. That has nothing to do with the condition. Okay, now let's look at the third situation. Stop it. Here we have x equals to 100. While x is equals to 100, you ask enter a number again. Now this time you actually update the value of x. All right, so how many iterations will the loop run? So let's look at an example. So say it will run at least one time. Okay, so it will run at least one time. It will execute line for at least one time because x is equals to 100 at the beginning. So it will execute line 4 and ask user for input. And once user enter a number that is not equals to 100, it will exit. So this will run at least once. But we don't know how many times it will run. It really depends on user input. If the user enter 100 and 100 and 100 again, then it will keep on asking user for input until user enters something that is not 100, then it will stop. So what we can say that is that it can only run at least once. Okay? So here, to summarize, okay, So typically, in the condition, we will have a variable. Okay, the variable needs to be initialized. All right. Initial value, okay, will decide whether the while loop will be executed once. All right. So we have seen if the initial value is such that the condition is false at the beginning, it will not execute at all. Okay. So if the initial value is such that the condition is false at the beginning, then the while loop is exited without executing the block of statements. All right. The variable in the condition needs to be updated in the block of statements to avoid infinite loop. As we have seen here, if it's value of x here is not updated, we have an infinite loop. Okay. Now, if the initial value, so if the initial value is such that the condition is true at the beginning, and that the value and the variable is updated inside the block of statements, then the loop will run at least once. Okay, as indicated in this here. So this will be true at the beginning. It will ask user for the value of x. Again, it get updated. So it will run at least once. And until, so it will stop, the loop will stop once the condition is false. Once user enter update the value of x for which the condition is false, then it will stop. Okay, so let's look at the example again. So here we see an example of using while loop to enter for the code that we have seen earlier. Okay, so we have seen this example where we have a simple calculator. It accepts any number of inputs. We assume user always enter integers. As long as user enters 0, you stop. Now, if you look at our example earlier on, which is here. Okay. If you look at line 3 here, this line 3 is the same as line 7. Could we create a code where there is no redundancy? We can line 3 be removed or be replaced so that we don't repeat this statement. No, so there are many ways to write this code. You can ask user for value first and then check whether it's not equal to 0. As long as it's not equal to 0, you run the following code. Now, another version of writing it, or another way of writing it, is to let the while loop run once. Okay. So we have this. So we're gonna basically say that we're gonna run this statement at least once, ask user for an input. Okay. Result plus equals to value. All right. Sorry, result we're gonna write this this runs once, this block of second run once, and this process means you add value into the result, and then you ask user value again. Now, when you do that, what is the value here? You have to be initialized. So if you add value equals to 0, then value not equals to 0 is false, so it will not run at all. Okay, so we can't set value is equals to 0. We can set value equals to some number that is not equal to 0. But if you do that, value not equals to 0 here will be false. Sorry, will be true. All right, so 100 is not equal to 0, so it's true. So you're gonna add 100 into result, but we don't want to add 100 into result. Okay, so that is not a, otherwise your result will have 100, which is not the right value. So what can we do here is that instead of having while not equals to 0, we can say while true. Okay, so as long as it's true, okay, we ask user for a value. All right, and if value is not equal to 0, you add value to result. Okay, and again, otherwise, you just break. Okay, so let's see how does it work. So let's say enter integer, I say 1, and then 2, and then I enter 0, and it say the sum of all the integers you enter is 0. So here, what happened here is that I add 0, which is wrong. I should add value. So let's try it again. I have 1, I have 2, and I add 0, where it stopped, and say the sum of all the integers you enter is 3. All right, so this code here basically do the same thing as, give the same result as the previous code, except that now we have a break here. We use break. It's a different way of writing. So, and this statement is always true. So this here will always run, okay? So the number of iterations here is not gonna be infinite, even though this condition is always true, because we have a break statement, all right? So in this example here, the condition does not has a variable, it's always true. However, we have a break statement to break the while loop, okay? So I'm gonna write here the following code and has conditions always true. Okay, so but it has a break statement. Okay, so it basically executes it once, asks user for an integer, and if tested, if value is not equal to 0, you add it into result. Else, that means value is equal to 0, you break, you exit the while loop, and you go to the next line, which is to print the sum of all the integers, which is the value of result. Okay, so we can, this example exhibit that you can use break statement inside a while loop. And however, so I'm gonna write here using break statement. A break statement can be used inside the while loop. However, it is usually not recommended. All right. Because as you can see, for break to happen, you require an if statement inside here. Now, if statements basically checking condition. So you basically have two conditions, one here and one here. You basically have two conditions to check. While while loop itself is already checking condition. So it's actually more recommended to not have two conditions to check, where you can actually incorporate here inside here. Because this statement here basically just say that you repeat it. It doesn't do much, okay? However, it create only this statement once rather than twice, as in the previous code where you ask user for input here and then also in the iteration. So usually if we can avoid using break, we will not recommend will not use break. We will just put all the conditions into a while loop so that the condition itself will give us, okay? So it is usually better to have all the conditions for which all the conditions in the while loop statement. So that when you just read the first line, you already know when this what is the condition that the while loop will exit. Okay, you don't have to read all the way to find out when would it exit, when will it break. Okay, instead you have combined all the conditions together. Okay, now let's look at another example here. Right, that they are more involved. You have a simple additional calculator. It accepts any number of inputs. Okay, we'll assume users enters either quit or an integer. And if user enter quit to stop adding values, okay, when the program exits, it outputs a total sum and so on. All right, so now we have using quit as a stopping value rather than 0. Okay, so if user enters 0, we will still keep on asking user for input. All right, so it's just a different way of writing, just a slight modification. So we're gonna do this. So modification here, we ask user for input. Now this time, we can't do typecast here because user can actually enter a quit here. So if we do typecast, there will be an error. So now what is our condition? The condition is that as long as it's not quit. Okay, so the condition. So write out the condition. So the condition is input of the value, so user input. So user input is not quit. Condition is that the user input is not equal to quit. Okay. And what is our block of statements? Okay. So the block of statements will be as add. So we're gonna add user input, which you need to typecast to int. Okay. Into result. Okay. And what is this result here? Result is the values that the sum of values that user have entered so far. Initialize to 0. At the beginning is 0 because user has not entered anything. Okay. So these are all the ingredients that you need to write for a while loop. So result is equals to 0. You ask user for input, while user input is not equals to quit. Okay. Then you add the int of user input into result. You can print in media statement and then ask user for input again. Okay, so let's try this. Suppose I ask user for integer, say 1, 2, and this time even if I add 0, it will still keep on asking. Okay, 9, and you can even add negative numbers, say -2, and so on. So from so you have now 1, 2, 0, 9, and so on and so forth. And then you ask, for example, quit, and now it's going to stop. Now something is wrong here. If you look at it, you see here that even I enter quit, the result now is it execute result now is 6, and it keeps asking for integer. Now this is where you need to stop and check what happened, which part is wrong. So if you look at it here, this is the value here. So value is being updated. Rather, the condition itself involve the user input as a variable. So we know that this is wrong. So we should make it into user input. We should update the variable in the condition. So let's run it again. This time is 1, 2. I enter something that is wrong. Okay, 1. Okay, hold on a second. I think I made a mistake here. So I'm gonna run it again. I have 1 here, and then 2, 3. Okay, let's try it one more time. 1, 2. I can even add a negative value. Now it's 0. I can add 7, anything. I can add 0. Once even I add 0, now it still run. It asks me for integer. So if I press quit now, and